The most dangerous word in money is not crash. It is safe, safe cash, safe bonds, safe real estate, safe blue chip exposure, safe monthly payments, safe lifestyle. I have watched people destroy decades of labor by wrapping it in that word and then going to sleep. When a debt cycle gets old, safety becomes the costume risk wears to get invited into your house. That is the part most people never understand until it is too late. They think wealth is lost because they bought something reckless. Sometimes that happens. More often, wealth is lost because they bought something familiar, something respectable, something everybody around them agreed was prudent. By the time they discover the danger, the room is crowded, the air is hot, and every person inside is moving toward the same narrow door. That is the image I want burned into your mind. A late debt cycle is a crowded room with one small exit. If you remember nothing else I say, remember that you do not get hurt first because an asset falls. You get hurt because you own something that only feels valuable while nobody needs to leave. The moment confidence weakens, you find out whether you own real purchasing power or just a claim on a system that was already too full. I have spent my life studying incentives, balance sheets, cash flows, and human behavior under pressure. The accounting matters, the psychology matters even more. People do not panic in the beginning. They normalize, they explain, they point to charts, they point to tradition. They say the government will handle it, the central bank will handle it, technology will solve it, productivity will catch up. America is different, this company is too large, this market is too deep, this house is in a good zip code, this bond is backed by the full faith and credit of the state. Then one day they realize everyone else was borrowing confidence from the same source, and confidence is a terrible thing to own on margin. Ray Dalio has spent years warning about the mechanics of the big debt cycle, and what matters to me is not the branding of the idea. What matters is the machine underneath it. The machine is older than any central bank alive, older than the dollar, older than Wall Street, older than the slogans people use to calm themselves down. Civilizations change. The mechanism does not. First comes trust. A nation is productive, it saves, it builds its currency, stands for something, its institutions still carry moral weight, the culture still respects delayed gratification, debt exists, but it is a servant, not a master. Money is a receipt for real work already done. Then comes stretch. Credit works so well that people begin to believe more credit is the same thing as more wealth. The government borrows because it can. Consumers borrow because everybody does. Corporations borrow because leverage flatters returns. Asset prices rise because cheap money makes almost everything look intelligent. A society mistakes expansion for invincibility, then comes fracture. The debt pile becomes too large to serve, honestly. The only way forward is some combination of debasement, financial repression, inflation, austerity, default, or political theater designed to disguise one of the first five. The promises remain on paper, but their quality changes. You still get paid. You just get paid in smaller dollars. Weaker currency, reduced purchasing power, thinner options, tighter conditions. Social trust starts to split because ordinary people feel poorer while the screens still flash record highs. Then comes transfer. That is the phase the public always experiences as a shock, though the pattern was visible years earlier. Wealth does not vanish. It moves. It moves from the passive holder of long promises to the owner of hard claims. It moves from the highly levered consumer to the low debt allocator. It moves from those who worship nominal value to those who measure real purchasing power. It moves from the crowded center of the room to the people who stood near the door before the smoke was visible. People hear that and think it sounds dramatic. History says it is conservative. Look at Rome. People like to talk about the Roman Empire as if its decline were purely political or military. Money was in the middle of it. When a state stretches beyond what production can support, it starts tampering with the unit people trust. The Roman denarius did not die in one theatrical moment. It was diluted over time. That is how most currency betrayals happen. A little shaving here, a little more there. The ordinary saver keeps using the same names for money and assumes the substance underneath the name is unchanged. It is not. By the time the public feels the full insult, a lifetime of honest saving has become a bad joke told by the state. Look at Weimar Germany. There, the process ran so fast that even slow minds could see it. Marks multiplied. Prices outran wages. Cash holders were not protected because they had liquidity. They were trapped because their liquidity was melting in real time. Bondholders got paid exactly the way drowning people receive water. They got more of what was killing them. The people who survived relatively intact were the ones who held claims on reality itself. Productive assets, land, hard goods, foreign currency. Anything not trapped inside the same burning arithmetic. Then look at Japan after the great asset bubble. That example matters because it does not fit the cartoon version people carry around. It was not wheelbarrows of cash. It was something colder, decades of disappointment, stocks cut down and then stayed down, real estate marked by long decay, an entire population learning that an asset can feel safe because it is culturally approved and still be ruinous if you buy it at the wrong point in the cycle with the wrong assumptions attached. People waited for a quick recovery because that is what they had been trained to expect. The market gave them a generation. Long lesson. Instead, 3 places, 3 eras, 3 costumes, same exit problem. The crowd always discovers the door at once. Now bring that pattern into the present. The world is sitting on an extraordinary mountain of debt. Governments are more indebted. Consumers in many countries are more indebted. Corporations spent years gorging on cheap money. Entire asset classes were priced under the assumption that near zero rates, endless liquidity, and gentle inflation were not temporary conditions, but the natural order of civilized finance. That assumption is one of the great financial delusions of the modern age. It trained people to confuse a favorable environment with permanent law. I want you to think about how much of your financial life has been built on that confusion. How much of what you call safety depends on low inflation? How much depends on cheap refinancing? How much depends on confidence in a currency that is issued by an entity already borrowing at a scale that would have looked absurd a generation ago? How much depends on buyers showing up later with the same faith you have today? Those are not academic questions, those are exit door questions. In the United States, the post-war period created enormous trust. The dollar sat at the center of the system. Industry was dominant, productivity was real, the balance sheet strength relative to the rest of the world was extraordinary. Then the arrangement changed, the link to hard restraint weakened, debt rose, first tolerably, then strategically, then habitually, then structurally. Deficits became normal central bank interventions, became ordinary. Every crisis taught the same lesson to policymakers and investors. Borrow more, print more, suppress more, rescue more. That strategy can carry a system a long way. It cannot carry it forever. There is a point in every debt cycle when the problem stops being whether obligations will be honored in nominal terms and becomes whether honoring them nominally will destroy them in real terms. Once you understand that distinction, you stop using the old language. You stop asking whether an asset is guaranteed. You ask what the guarantee is worth after the issuer has done whatever it needed to do to survive. That is the language of adults. Most portfolios are still built in the language of children. Now let me tell you where ordinary people get themselves hurt, because the danger is not random. In a late cycle, the same 5 mistakes keep showing up. They come dressed as prudence, tradition, diversification, aspiration, and discipline. Underneath, they are all versions of the same error. They trap you away from the exit. The first trap is the long promise. People call long-duration government bonds safe because they imagine safety as the certainty of getting paid. I do not define it that way. If you lend money for 30 years to an issuer drowning in obligations at a fixed rate, in a currency that can be diluted, you do not own safety. You own duration risk married to policy desperation. You own what I call borrowed safety. A bond is not a store of value. A bond is a legal sentence about future money. That distinction matters. If inflation runs above your coupon, your purchasing power erodes even when every payment arrives on schedule. If the currency is quietly debased across the life of the bond, your contract can be honored and your wealth can still be destroyed. You can cash every check and lose the game. People dislike hearing that because they were taught that treasuries sit at the conservative end of the spectrum. In certain environments they do. In a late debt cycle, especially at long maturities, they can become elegant instruments of slow confiscation. The state does not need to seize your money directly. It only needs you to lend to it on terms that guarantee the real value comes back, thinner than it left. You feel prudent the entire time. That is what makes it so dangerous. The second trap is passive cash worship. You need liquidity. I keep liquidity. Liquidity is not the enemy. The mistake is treating large piles of cash in a debasement. Prone currency is long-term wealth protection. Cash is not a fortress. When the unit itself is under pressure, it is a waiting room. And if the waiting room is inside the same building that has started to burn, then sitting quietly is not discipline. It is denial. People tell themselves cash is harmless because it does not fluctuate much on a screen. That is one of the stupidest habits modern finance has taught. Volatility is not the only way to lose money. Quiet erosion counts too. In fact, it is often more destructive because it does not provoke defensive behavior. You do not get a dramatic headline. You get thinner groceries, weaker purchasing power, rising insurance, higher taxes, expensive repair bills, costlier education, and a life that requires more dollars to stand still. That is the invisible tax. Most people can recognize a thief. They struggle to recognize dilution, because dilution leaves the furniture in place while stealing the room. If you hold cash for operating flexibility, that is one thing. If you hold it because you think it protects a decade of accumulated labor from a late-stage monetary system, you are confusing stillness with safety. Stillness is not safety. Stillness is just movement you failed to measure. The third trap is equity without pricing power. When people hear a warning about stocks, they usually swing from one childish extreme to another. Either stocks are always dangerous or stocks are always the answer. Neither view deserves your money. Equity is not one thing. The question is whether the business can defend its economics when the environment turns hostile. Late debt cycles punish the weak from multiple directions at once. Input costs rise, interest expense rises. The consumer weakens, refinancing gets harder. The businesses that live on thin margins, easy credit, commodity offerings, and customer fragility do not just suffer lower enthusiasm, they suffer structural compression if they cannot pass cost increases through, if they need cheap funding to look healthy. If their customers are themselves living on borrowed oxygen, then their equity can turn from a growth story into a trapdoor. I do not avoid equities. I avoid fragile equities. That is a very different sentence. If a business has genuine pricing power, strong margins, low debt, global revenue streams, durable demand and management that respects capital allocation, then inflation can bruise it without killing it. If a business sells what people can postpone, carries leverage it cannot comfortably serve, and relies on a consumer who needs the same easy money conditions that are now disappearing, then the stock is not ownership in a fortress. It is a seat in a crowded theater. People think diversification means owning many tickers. Often it means owning many ways to lose to the same macro pressure. The fourth trap is peak. Price real estate bought with peak credit assumptions. This one stings because housing is emotional. People do not buy a house the way they buy an industrial company. They buy identity, they buy social proof, they buy the feeling of arrival, they buy stability or what they imagine stability looks like from the sidewalk. I understand that instinct. I do not respect the math that usually accompanies it. Real estate can be wonderful. It can also be a disaster. The difference is price leverage, yield, flexibility, and the regime you are buying into. When cheap debt inflated property values for years, buyers came to believe the old story had become a law of nature. Houses only go one direction over time. Mortgage debt is good debt. You have to buy now or you will never get in. Stretching is fine because future appreciation will rescue the decision. Those beliefs create some of the worst financial cages I know. If you buy residential real estate in a heavily credit-dependent market at elevated valuations using maximum leverage, thin cash reserves, and the assumption that rates or refinancing conditions will become friendlier later, you are not purchasing stability. You are chaining your optionality to one local asset and one policy path. If rates remain high, affordability weakens. If the economy slows, buyers disappear. If maintenance and taxes rise, your carrying cost goes up. If the property does not produce a compelling yield, then a large share of the thesis is simply hope wearing granite countertops. Hope is not a yield. I am not telling you never own a home. I am telling you never confuse cultural approval with balance sheet strength. A highly levered property purchased in a fragile credit regime is often not an asset. It is a lifestyle decision that borrows the language of investing. The fifth trap is lifestyle debt disguised as progress. This one destroys more households than any bear market. The modern consumer has been trained to finance identity. The car is financed, the vacations are financed, the luxury watch is financed, the kitchen remodel is financed, the entertainment package is financed, the wardrobe is financed, the emotional recovery after a hard work week is financed. Buy now, pay later is simply another way of saying sell your future for present mood regulation. People do this while calling themselves practical. The arithmetic is brutal. Consumer balance sheets loaded with installment debt, credit card debt, variable rate exposure, and prestige spending do not merely reduce savings. They remove resilience. They weaken your ability to refuse. They turn every downturn, job interruption, medical event, family problem, and economic shock into a crisis, because the machine must be fed every month. That is why I care so much about refusal power. If your bills own your behavior, you do not have a financial plan. You have a handler. People ask why some families survive hard periods while others crack. It is not always because the survivors were richer going in. Often they were simply cleaner, less debt, fewer vanity obligations, more hard savings, more willingness to look dull in good times so they could look composed in bad times. Most households that break under pressure were not ambushed by one catastrophic event. They were softened first by years of financed consumption that made them seem prosperous while reducing their actual margin for error. Now, I want to address the great sedative people use whenever this cycle is discussed. They say this time is different. They say America will innovate its way through it. They say artificial intelligence, biotechnology, energy breakthroughs, productivity leaps, and entrepreneurial dynamism will outrun the burden. They say institutions are strong enough. They say the dollar is too central to fail. They say there is no alternative. They say the crowd may be large, but the room is special. I never build my fortune on national bedtime stories. Innovation matters, productivity matters, institutions matter, but none of those things repeal arithmetic. If debt compounds faster than the real economic capacity to support it, then the system eventually has to choose how to disappoint people, maybe through inflation, maybe through repression, maybe through taxes, maybe through asset repricing, maybe through some elegant blend of all four, but disappointment will be assigned. The only real question is who absorbs it. Technology can create extraordinary fortunes. It can also widen inequality, concentrate gains, and arrive on a timeline that does not solve a present fiscal gap. Those are not contradictory statements. They are often the same statement. The owners of scarce technology may get rich at exactly the same time that broad purchasing power weakens and public finances remain strained. A breakthrough for the few does not automatically rescue the many. Never confuse pockets of brilliance with a repaired system. You need to stop thinking in nominal returns and start thinking in real control. That mental shift is where most people fail, because the financial industry trains them to celebrate the wrong scoreboard. If your account rises 7% in a year, when your real cost of living, taxes, fees, and hidden inflation rise nearly as much, then your screen gave you emotional relief, not financial progress. A late debt cycle is full of false victories like that. I call it scoreboard anesthesia. The number goes up and you stop asking what the number buys. That is how whole populations drift into diminished freedom while believing they are doing reasonably well. So, what do you do if you are serious? You begin by auditing your exit risk. I would want to know what percentage of my net worth depends on one currency, one policy regime, one central bank, one style of equity exposure, one refinancing assumption, and one consumption pattern. I would want to know how much of my life requires stable rates, stable employment, stable confidence, stable housing prices, and stable government credibility, just to avoid stress. I would want to know whether my supposed diversification is simply a cluster of assets that all fail when real rates, inflation, and confidence move against them at once. Most people do not run that audit because they do not want the answer. You should want the answer more than the comfort. Then I would reduce single-door risk. I would not want my future chained to long promises and weakening money. I would not want excessive idle cash pretending to be a strategy. I would not want a portfolio loaded with businesses that need cheap credit and forgiving customers to survive. I would not want a giant mortgage justified by optimistic appreciation. I would not want household obligations that require ideal conditions just to remain manageable. I would want room. That word matters to me. Room in the monthly budget, room in the balance sheet, room in the timeline, room in the portfolio, room in my mind. When the cycle turns, people with room can act. People without room can only react. Acting compounds, reacting usually liquidates. I would also care deeply about what I call reality-backed claims. That means assets and businesses tied to something harder than optimism. It can mean productive land. It can mean hard assets. It can mean businesses with real pricing power and low debt. It can mean revenue streams not trapped in one weak domestic demand pocket. It can mean selective international exposure in healthier balance sheet environments. It can mean gold, not as a religion, but as insurance against policy vanity and currency dilution. It can mean liquidity held for optionality, but not worshipped as a long-term store of purchasing power. There is no single perfect answer. There is only a more honest question. What still holds value if the promises get honored and you lose anyway? That question will clean your portfolio faster than 100 hours of television. I also want you to understand something about leverage on the personal side. Every dollar of consumer debt is not equal, but every form of unnecessary lifestyle leverage reduces future negotiating power. It reduces your ability to wait. It reduces your ability to walk away from a bad job. It reduces your ability to survive a lean period without selling at the bottom. It reduces your ability to buy when others are forced to dump assets. In a late debt cycle, that last point matters enormously. The real edge is not predicting every macro turn. The real edge is staying solvent, liquid enough, and psychologically composed enough to exploit the turns. I have made many good investments. They were not all born from brilliance. Some were born from the simple fact that I had capital available when others did not. The crowd studies asset selection and ignores condition selection. Your financial condition determines what opportunities are even available to you when the system tightens. A person with low debt, high savings, discipline, flexible living costs, and a portfolio aimed at real purchasing power can endure bad headlines without being forced into stupid decisions. A person with impressive income, big fixed obligations, prestige debt, and blind faith in nominal guarantees may look richer until the day the room gets crowded. Then appearances reverse fast. That is how wealth transfer works. Not as poetry, as mechanics. The transfer is from the rushed to the prepared, from the levered to the patient, from the buyer of stories to the owner of substance, from the citizen of the crowded center to the quiet person already standing near the exit. And I need to say one uncomfortable thing more clearly than most people ever will. The state is not your fiduciary in a late debt cycle. The financial system is not your parent. Wall Street is not a shelter. A government promising to pay in its own currency is not the same thing as a government promising to preserve your purchasing power. A retirement account statement is not a certificate of safety. A house at a high appraisal is not proof of freedom. A stable monthly payment is not the same thing as a stable life. Those distinctions are where fortunes are saved or lost. If you keep thinking like an employee, you will measure security by monthly routine. If you think like an owner, you will measure security by asset quality, balance, sheet resilience, optionality, and purchasing power. Employee thinking asks whether the paycheck clears. Owner thinking asks what remains if the currency weakens, the cost of living rises, and the system stops subsidizing mistakes. That is the split in the road. One path keeps you in the room because everybody else is there and the music is still playing. The other path feels lonely earlier and safer later. I know which path built everything good in my life. Patience is not passivity. Caution is not cowardice. Preparing for repricing is not pessimism. It is respect for the cycle, respect for history, and respect for the math that humiliates people who think confidence can outvote compounding debt. I am not telling you to live in fear. Fear is a bad allocator. I am telling you to stop anesthetizing yourself with conventional comfort. The people who usually get hit hardest are not the openly reckless. They are the conventionally exposed. They own what everybody said to own finance the way everybody said to finance it, and trusted the same institutions everybody trusted. When the turn comes, they are too surprised to move and too crowded to exit well. Do not be that person. Do not spend 10, 20, 30 years of disciplined labor building a pile of nominal claims that depend on the kindness of a late-stage debt regime. Do not tell yourself that being highly educated, highly employed, and broadly diversified guarantees anything, if the diversification is superficial and the liabilities are real. Do not let your household become a hostage to weak money, expensive debt, and assets whose value depends on tomorrow's buyer being even more optimistic than you are today. Build refusal power. Build room. Build reality-backed claims. Build a life that can survive a long squeeze without begging the market for mercy, because that is what this really comes down to. Not whether Ray Dalio is exactly right on the month. Not whether the next headline arrives this quarter or next year. Not whether the reset is dramatic or drawn out. Those are details. The principle is larger. When debt compounds beyond what honesty can support, the exit eventually matters more than the entry, and most people wait far too long to ask where the door is. So here is the test I would give you tonight. Walk through your balance sheet as if you had to defend it in a room full of hard men who cared nothing for your feelings and everything for your purchasing power. Ask yourself which assets keep working. If inflation stays stubborn, Ask which promises remain attractive if the currency weakens. Ask which expenses own you. Ask which debts reduce your future options. Ask which investments rely on cheap money, generous multiples, and peaceful confidence. Ask how much of your wealth would still feel solid if the crowd suddenly noticed the exit. Then ask the hardest question of all, are you holding wealth, or are you holding your place in line? That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is the dividing line between people who come out of a debt reset thinner, angrier, and older, and people who come out with more control than they had before. The cycle does not care how respectable your assumptions were. It does not care that the asset was popular. It does not care that the payment was manageable. It does not care that the guarantee sounded official. It only cares whether you recognize the room for what it was before the crowd turned toward the door. Most people will not. You still can.